My nighttime trucking route was going as usual. I was transporting a load of goods to a distant city and had decided to take a secondary road to avoid the heavy traffic of the main routes. It was a remote road, flanked by dense forests, with the only light coming from the truck's headlights and the moon. The night was clear, but the atmosphere around me felt strangely heavy. As I drove, I began to notice that the road was becoming eerily quiet, with the sound of the tires against the asphalt being the only noise breaking the silence. There was no sign of other vehicles or even wildlife. As I continued, an unusual glow appeared ahead. At first, I thought it was a light from a stationary vehicle or an emergency signal. But as I approached, I realized it was a bluish light pulsating in an irregular pattern. It seemed to emanate from a specific point at the roadside. Intrigued, I decided to stop and investigate. When I stepped out of the truck and approached the source of the light, what I found defied any logical explanation. The light emanated from a strange circle on the ground, surrounded by symbols I couldn't identify. It was as if the asphalt around it had been marked with some sort of enigmatic ritual or inscription. The blue glow seemed to dance and shift, creating a sense of disorientation. The discomfort grew when I noticed that the circle was enveloped in a thick mist that didn't seem to dissipate, even with the wind blowing. The atmosphere was charged, and the air felt icy. I decided to return to the truck, but when I tried to start the engine, I discovered that the truck wouldn't start. The battery was completely dead, despite no signs of failure before. Fear began to set in. I tried to use my cell phone to call for assistance, but the signal was completely out of reach. As I waited and tried to find a solution, I started to hear strange sounds coming from the forest around me. It was as if something was moving among the trees, and the sound of light footsteps and scratching started to draw closer. Panic increased as the blue light began to flash more intensely. I felt as though I was being watched, and the sensation of an invisible presence became almost oppressive. With the situation growing increasingly unbearable, I decided to seek refuge inside the truck and wait until dawn. With the first light of morning, the strange blue light had vanished, as had the thick mist. The truck started up as if nothing had happened, and the cell signal returned. When I reported the incident to roadside assistance, no one could provide a plausible explanation. The symbols and blue light remained a complete mystery. What happened that night continues to haunt me. The road, which had once seemed like just an ordinary secondary route, is now etched in my memory as a place where the inexplicable and mysterious intersect. I have never driven that road again, and whenever I drive at night, I can't help but think of the blue glow and the symbols I encountered, and the feeling that somewhere, something strange is waiting in the darkness. During a long night drive, I often chose less traveled routes to avoid traffic and save time. One night, I decided to take a secondary road that wound through a mountainous region. The road was narrow and twisted between trees and hills, and I was keeping an eye on the signs of wear starting to appear on my truck. After hours of driving, I noticed that the fuel was nearly empty. With no gas stations in sight, I started to worry. That's when I spotted a faint light in the distance, which appeared to be coming from an old, abandoned gas station. The place was isolated and the lighting was minimal, but the sight of the station was a relief, despite its rundown appearance. I pulled into the station, which was surrounded by a rusty fence and had a deteriorating roof structure. The sign, although covered in grime and rust, still read "Gas Station." The desolation was palpable, with the wind whistling through the empty structures and an almost absolute silence. I decided to refuel the truck using the pump, which still seemed functional. However, as I began operating the pump, I noticed the fuel was coming out much slower than usual and with a strange smell. The station appeared to have been closed for a long time, but the pump was in surprisingly good condition. The fuel tank was nearly empty, and the flow was erratic. While I waited, I started to explore the station. The place was covered in dust and cobwebs. Inside the convenience store, I found empty shelves and outdated products, as if the station had been abruptly abandoned. There was also an old cash register and several papers scattered on the floor. What caught my eye was a notebook on a table, filled with strange notes about something called the Lost Road. Curiosity led me to read some of the notes, which spoke of unexplained phenomena and warnings not to travel a specific road after dark. The notebook was filled with bizarre drawings and hurried annotations. I was intrigued but decided it was time to leave. When I returned to the truck, I noticed the sky was starting to darken, and the surroundings seemed to transform. The station's light began to flicker intermittently, and the wind had picked up, creating a strange sound that echoed through the station. As I tried to start the truck, the engine began to sputter. The station's light flickered faster and faster, and I felt a growing sense of urgency. The chill down my spine intensified when I realized the fuel tank was lower than I had thought. Something was clearly wrong. I decided not to wait any longer and quickly began to leave the station. The environment around me was becoming increasingly oppressive, with shadows that seemed to move in unsettling ways. As I drove away, I noticed the station appeared to shrink from view, as if it was disappearing into the darkness. Eventually, I managed to get back onto the main road. The abandoned gas station was left behind, and the rest of the trip was less disturbing. However, the experience left me with a sense of unease. The feeling of being watched and the strange surroundings of the station continue to haunt me. When I tried to report the incident to other drivers and locals in the area, no one seemed to know about the station or had heard of it. It was as if it had appeared and disappeared overnight. The sensation of having stumbled upon a place lost in time and shrouded in mystery remains one of the most unsettling experiences of my trucking career. The night was particularly dreadful. It had started with a light drizzle but soon turned into a violent storm. I was driving my truck down a remote rural road, trying to complete a delivery before dawn. The wind howled and the rain poured in torrents, making visibility nearly non-existent. The roads were soaked and slippery, and the sound of rain pounding on the truck's roof was almost deafening. As I drove, I noticed the headlights reflecting off something on the road ahead. At first, it looked like a large dark object blocking the way, but I couldn't make out what it was. As I got closer, I realized it was a car stopped right in the middle of the road, completely abandoned. The car had its lights on and seemed to have been left there recently. A growing sense of unease prompted me to stop and check if someone needed help. However, as soon as I set foot outside the truck, an overwhelming urge to return inside overtook me. The storm was intensifying, and the roar of the rain and wind made everything even more terrifying. Back inside the truck, I noticed the situation was getting worse. The abandoned car felt like a trap, and my fears were confirmed when I saw headlights approaching rapidly in the rearview mirror. Another vehicle was speeding towards me, its headlights piercing through the heavy rain. The unknown vehicle seemed to be in a direct pursuit. I accelerated the truck, trying to escape the situation, but the car kept closing in, maintaining a constant distance as if it were deliberately following me. The sensation of being hunted was palpable, and the slick road only made driving at high speed more challenging. Desperate to escape, I veered onto a secondary road, hoping that changing routes would be enough to lose the pursuer. The road was even narrower and more winding, with trees and bushes nearly brushing against the sides of the truck. The car continued to follow, its headlights glaring intensely and casting ominous shadows on the trees. The storm seemed to heighten the mystery of the chase. Lightning illuminated the sky, briefly revealing the shape of the unknown vehicle. The feeling of desperation grew as the road ahead seemed to narrow and twist even further, as if it were leading to an unknown and sinister place. Eventually, I spotted a small clearing ahead, an apparently deserted and unlit area. I decided to enter the clearing, hoping that the lack of visibility and the rough terrain would be enough to lose the car tailing me. I parked the truck and turned off the engine, trying to maintain as much silence as possible. The storm continued to rage around me, and the sound of thunder seemed to blend with the pounding of my heart. I waited in the darkness, straining to hear any sign of the pursuing vehicle. The silence that followed seemed endless. The pursuing vehicle had vanished, and the storm was growing louder. After what felt like an eternity, I finally decided to leave the clearing and return to the main road. To my surprise, the car that had been following me seemed to have disappeared without a trace. The road was once again calm, and the storm began to subside. I reached my destination with a sense of relief and a story that seemed almost unbelievable. What happened that night continues to haunt me. The car that chased me and the feeling of being hunted in the darkness and storm are memories that remain vivid and unsettling.